Thank you, Ashley. I'm really happy to welcome you all this evening to Wild Napa and our presentation by Ben Pearl. This is part of the Napa's County Libraries grant from the California Coastal Commission, which is called H2O Superheroes. We're providing information for our community all around Napa about the wildlife as well as the environment and the waterways, in hopes that we'll learn to appreciate our environment, waterways, and our beautiful landscapes and begin to protect them. So if you still want to sign up for the superhero program, you can do it online at the library website, which I will type into the Zoom box, but it's www.napalibrary.org/H2O, and you can continue learning all about the wildlife and our environment and protecting our waterways and oceans. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Anne. We couldn't do this without you. As some of you may know, we often hold these in a normal time of the world. We will hold these at Napa County Library here in Napa, or down in American Canyon, or up in St. Helena. So one day we will all meet together again, but today is not that day, so thanks for joining us. So my name is Ashley. I'm the Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator here at Napa County Resource Conservation District. For those of you who don't know who we are a non-regulatory agency. We operate within the boundaries of Napa County. And although we do a whole bunch of different things, including education and agriculture assistance, and irrigation, water management, biological monitoring, you know, it boils down to helping you care for the land, water, soil, and wildlife here in Napa County. So thanks again so much for supporting these programs and joining us. If you would like, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'll pop my email into the chat boxes in both Facebook Live and through Zoom. If you would like to receive our Napa RCD email list, we do a monthly newsletter. And as we're sort of going through the shelter in place, we've been doing a weekly newsletter as well, with activities to help you connect with the environment here in Napa County and beyond. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and just send me an email and I can get you signed up for that. The Wild series is only made possible through our partners. One of our biggest partners is, of course, Ann Davis and all of her wonderful team at the Napa County Library. But we also do a lot of work with the Watershed Information and Conservation Council, the Friends of the Napa River, the Carolyn Parr Nature Center. For those of you who join us in person, they're the lovely, lovely people who always bring us cookies, which is always fun. The Napa Valley Vintners, and again, we want to thank Ann Davis and everybody at the library. So we are continuing to hold all of our programming virtually. We're doing some irrigation programs coming up in June, and we'll continue on with the Wild series in June and July and August, I think, until we're able to gather together again. We'll continue doing these programs live, which I think is, you know, not surprising for most people in today's world. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop talking, because nobody's here to listen to me and all of you are here to listen to Ben. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben. And Ben, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, take it away, Ben.
All right, thank you, Ashley. And first I want to thank the Napa County Resource Conservation District for inviting me to talk today. You know, I was looking forward to coming up there, but obviously that wasn't in the cards. So glad we could make it work, and also include some folks from SFVBO and down in the South Bay. So, so I am the Plover and Tern Program Director for the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. We are based in Milpitas, and conduct a lot of science and also outreach throughout the South Bay, which kind of ends up being everything south of the San Mateo Bridge. We do also do work sometimes in the Santa Cruz Mountains or in the Diablo Range, but really a lot of our work is down by the Bay. And we're pretty much focused on conserving birds through both kind of monitoring as well as habitat restoration, and also through outreach. So just a little bit of background on myself. I got my undergrad degree at UC Santa Cruz in ecology and evolution, and then took a few years off, eventually moved over to the Hill, went to San Jose State, got my master's in environmental studies, and that's when I began working with San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. That was back in 2013, and I've been with SFBBO ever since. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with our talk tonight. And I'm going to talk mostly about snowy plovers in the bay, but I will also weave in least terns later on. Least terns have kind of showed up a little bit more recently, so we will get to them, so don't worry about that. So just a quick outline. I'll go over some ecology of snowy plovers, talk about some of the research and restoration that we've done, and then also talk about some potential volunteer opportunities for those of you who are interested. And also just a couple themes maybe for you to think about, and that is, what is restoration? It might seem like a straightforward idea, but you'll come to see it's not always the case. Also, how do we address urban wildlife habitat restoration? It's, obviously we're in the San Francisco Bay. It's very built out. Not a whole lot of, quote unquote, untouched nature left, but there still is restoration work to be done. And then also another important question, how do we address restoration when we have multiple listed species that have incompatible habitat needs? And this is something that we find ourselves dealing with here in the South Bay. So just on a basic level, Western snowy plovers are a small ground nesting shorebird. Just to give you a sense of their size, they're about the size, the height of a soda can. And they weigh anywhere from 32, 33 grams to 50 grams, which ends up being somewhere between 6 and 8 quarters. So they're very, very small birds, very light overall. During the breeding season, we're able to differentiate males and females by their breeding plumage. You can see the male on the left has a dark crown, and dark neck patches, as well as behind the ear. However, during the non-breeding season, those markings fade. So it becomes a lot harder to tell the difference between male and female. And I should note, when you look at the female up on the right, you can tell she still has some of those markings, but they're overall much lighter. Now, something really important to note about snowy plovers, and this is going to be a recurring theme, is that they're really, really cryptic. They really try and blend into their habitat. They choose habitats that help them blend in. They really prefer to run around rather than fly. And that's sort of the way that they try and evade predators. Now, for the Pacific Coast population, their habitat extends from southern Washington down through Baja, California, and they are year-round throughout most of that range. There are some subtle differences depending where you are. So most snowy plovers range-wide use dune-backed sandy beaches, occasionally river bars, some natural salt pan. Here in the San Francisco Bay, obviously we don't have dune-backed sandy beaches in the bay itself, but what we do have a lot of is salt pan habitat in former salt production ponds. We also have the levees that are associated with these ponds, and occasionally dredge material, if it dries out, can also provide some nice habitat for snowy plovers. Now, something really important to understand is that, historically the San Francisco Bay was a giant system of tidal marsh. It really was just a massive amount, the largest tidal marsh ecosystem on the Pacific coast. There was probably a small amount of salt pan. I think it's estimated at about 1,300 acres of salt pan within the bay. So snowy plovers probably were present. The exact amount is not known. However, what happened in the mid-1800s after the gold rush, people began to produce salt in the South Bay and these tidal marshes. And so what we have is this kind of large-scale transition from what you see here to basically kind of more like this giant sort of moonscape. And so we actually had a large increase in the amount of snowy plovers in the Bay Area. Now, just a little bit about their life history. During the non-breeding season, they are partially migratory. So some snowy plovers will kind of remain in the same area year-round. Some will migrate elsewhere for the winter and then return to where they were born to breed. Some will actually kind of migrate to a different area and then breed elsewhere. But in general, they're going to stick around somewhat close to where they came from. And again, they do remain cryptic throughout all stages of their life history. So if you take a look at these snowy plovers on a sandy beach, they're kind of scattered throughout the beach rack, trying to blend in pretty well. This is, not amazing, crypsis, but still, if they weren't moving, they'd be pretty hard to see. Same story in salt ponds, and you'll have to excuse my digiscope pictures here, but you can see we've also got some snowy plovers scattered among oyster shells, something that I will talk a bit more about in just a little bit. And then as far as during the breeding season, adults share incubation duties. So females are the ones who incubate during the day, as you can see the picture on the left. And then you can see the picture on the right, both of these taken with a camera trap. You can see those darker colorations on the male, and he's incubating at night. Now, something that is sort of unique about snowy plovers, specifically along the Pacific coast, is that they have a polyandrous mating system. Now, what this means is that males and females are going to incubate the eggs, but once they hatch, the female is actually going to abandon and leave the male to raise the chicks. And depending on the time of the season, she will go ahead and pair up with another male and start a new nest. Normally, it's going to be fairly close by, but I think there have been records documented of a female traveling hundreds of miles and then rebreeding somewhere else. So pretty unique system, and kind of something always interesting to share. So if you look at the bottom right, actually, you can see that isn't a four-legged male plover. That's actually a male that is brooding his chicks. That's really one of the important things that males will do, especially when they're young. They're very, very small. It'll help them to thermoregulate, and then he'll also lead them to some foraging habitat where they can hopefully grow big and strong and fledge. Now, their nests are typically 1 to 3 eggs, but 3 eggs is the most common clutch size. And again, cryptic coloration is really, really important for them. So you can see it's got sort of a little salt and pepper coloration thing going on, and you can see by the type of habitats they choose, they really do blend in quite well. So it definitely takes someone who's experienced with nest finding to locate them. And even so, sometimes we're looking for nests and we're kind of looking, and then we suddenly realize it's right in front of us. So it can be pretty challenging trying to find their nests. Now, they do sometimes get creative where they have their nests. So we do sometimes do an event called a mud stomp to create footprints in the mud, give them nice places to nest. In this case, we had somebody who had trespassed and walked barefoot, which I certainly would not recommend, but snowy plovers felt that was a nice place to put their nest. We put down a lot of oyster shells as part of an enhancement, and I'll talk about that more. Normally not specifically for snowy plovers to put the eggs in, but inevitably every year there is a couple nests directly in those oyster shells, which is always kind of fun. And then something to know about the habitat here is that there is duck hunting allowed during the winter. So we have a lot of decoys that sort of get left out in various places, and we had this one that was kind of that was put in a broken down decoy, which we thought was kind of unique. Now, chicks are precocial. Now, what this means is that basically within hours of hatching, they run around and they're going to feed themselves. So they do need to be very cryptic again. So during the first couple weeks of their life, they really try and blend into their environment. So when a predator approaches, they're most likely going to just crouch on the ground right in place and hide. And their coloration, again, is going to help them to do that. Hopefully, they're also in a place where they can maybe hide under some vegetation, or at least the habitat will help them to do so. Once they hit 2 weeks, there's kind of a big change. They start to get some of their pin feathers coming in. They're fast enough that they can evade some predators by running, and so then they're going to be running more to evade predators. They still will potentially hide, but in any case, they'll fledge in anywhere from 28 to 33 days. And what that means is at that point they're able to fly, and they'll no longer be cared for by the male. Now, there are certainly a lot of reasons for their decline, but predators are certainly a main reason. This includes everything from raptors like peregrine falcons, which obviously at one time were a threatened species in their own right, or an endangered species, and have recovered pretty well here in the San Francisco Bay, and now definitely pose a significant threat to snowy plovers. We have mammals like the invasive red fox, which just so it's known, because I was confused about this until somewhat recently, they are native to California. They're native to the Sacramento Valley. They're also native to the Sierra Nevadas, the Sierra Nevada red fox, which is a very rare species, but they are not native to the San Francisco Bay or anywhere on the coast. They've been able to spread to the coast because of kind of human society, and they've caused a lot of problems for snowy plovers and other ground nesting birds and mammals. And then of course corvids. We have to talk about corvids. So believe it or not, common ravens and crows, well, especially common ravens, used to be rare in the San Francisco Bay, and now you could drive around and you go to, maybe a place with a little bit of nature, and you'll definitely see some ravens, and they're pretty consistent around the areas that we work with snowy plovers. And the thing about corvids is they're just really, really smart. So they recognize patterns. They actually recognize faces. They recognize trucks. So if there is some people who are trying to keep them out of different habitats, they'll recognize them, and they'll react in a different way because of that. So the corvids certainly pose a major challenge to us. Also have to mention California gulls. California gulls are another interesting species because until 1981, they did not breed in the San Francisco Bay or anywhere along the California coast. Their main breeding site in California is still in Mono Lake, but it was in that year that water levels went down low enough that a land bridge formed to their colony, and their colony was devastated. And what happened is that same year, SFBBO documented about, I want to say it was 50 gulls that were breeding in some salt ponds in the South Bay. Now, we've been tracking their population every year since. Their population now in the South Bay is up to 50,000 adults. So it's pretty impressive the way they've been able to grow, largely because gulls are they're very resourceful. You can see the picture on top. They're a big problem at landfills. They're able to get food in multiple ways. And they cause a lot of problems, not only for snowy plovers, but for other ground nesting species like American avocets. You can see, unfortunately, this gull has an avocet chick that it's flying away with. And some other problems that they cause is that they actually will take up habitat that might otherwise be used by snowy plovers and other ground nesting species. So another species that has caused some harm for snowy plovers. Aside from that, disturbance certainly is a major factor for snowy plovers. When you think about the fact that the majority of snowy plovers breed along sandy beaches, this also happens to be a place that a lot of people like to come to hang out. And there's been a lot of development. And so what we've seen is that over the years, snowy plovers have actually abandoned over half of their historical breeding sites just in California. So that's had some really big effects upon their population because there's less places for them to breed. One of the reasons that their population has declined is because they're very, very sensitive to disturbance. As I mentioned, they have very cryptic coloration. When they sit on a nest, their best way to defend against predators is to run and hide when they see a predator. So we've documented snowy plovers running off and hiding from the nest as far as 600 feet away. And that's kind of a way that they've adapted so that hopefully the predator doesn't even know that there are eggs there. So if you think about a sandy beach and you've got lots of people, even if they're able to get eggs down, they're most likely going to abandon because it's just going to be too much disturbance for them to handle. That is, of course, also potentially a concern here in the Bay because we do have trails next to ponds. Dogs, certainly a major issue. Obviously, people like to bring their dogs to the beaches, and I'm a dog owner myself and love dogs as well. But unfortunately, even if it seems like your dog is harmless and it's just playing and it's not going to attack birds, it does cause them a lot of stress, and it causes them to use up a lot of energy. And so this can have some pretty big effects on snowy plovers, whether we're talking during the winter, which is that picture you see in the corner, or during the breeding season. If you've got a male with some chicks, and the male might get separated from his chick, and then the chick is going to be kind of on its own. Or in some unfortunate situations, you may actually have dogs that actually attack snowy plover chicks, like we see in the bottom right corner. Of course, habitat loss is also a major issue. We talk about sandy beaches. Invasive plants like European dune grass, Ammophila, is certainly a major issue. And this causes a couple different things. For one, it just kind of physically chokes up the habitat. Snowy plovers really need to be able to see around them to detect those predators and kind of run off a nest if one approaches. So because of all of this tall grass, they're most likely going to avoid a lot of that habitat. And then the other thing is actually European dune grass will kind of reform how dunes kind of move, and will make them bigger and steeper and make it lower quality habitat for snowy plovers. Now, again, we don't have dunes for the most part in the San Francisco Bay, but in the salt ponds, we do actually have slender leaf ice plant that is a common invader in a lot of the ponds. This kind of physically covers up a lot of that bare habitat that snowy plovers need for nesting. That is kind of an important hallmark. Snowy plovers need mostly unvegetated, kind of bare, flat habitat. So it covers it up. And then the other thing is that if they do nest nearby this slender leaf ice plant, it actually kind of makes them stand out a lot more. So it reduces the quality of their crypsis. Climate change also is certainly something that we thinking about now, and we're really going to have to consider. If you think about sea level rise, it's projected to be about 1 to 2 meters by the year 2100. That's kind of analogous to a king tide. And so here we have a picture of the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk, which I assume many of you have been to and familiar with this beach. So this is during a king tide, and what you can see is that there's really not a lot of beach left. So if you think about the effects that's going to have along coastal beach habitat, there really isn't a lot of room for the beach to migrate because of development in a lot of places. So snowy plovers are certainly going to face issues on the coast, and then certainly in the San Francisco Bay where they mostly reside in salt ponds. Higher water levels may kind of reduce the ability of us to manage salt ponds for them, manage water levels so that they can have that dry habitat that they need. Now, because of all these different reasons, snowy plovers have been listed as federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. What this means is that whether during the breeding season or during the wintertime, they are protected from harassment. Now, just to give you a sense, range-wide, how their population is doing, you can see that we have been on an upward trend. In 2018, that's the last year that we have data published. We counted during annual breeding surveys almost 2,400 adults. So we are seeing that upward trend. The range-wide recovery goal across the entire Pacific Coast is 3,000 adults. Now, I should mention that based upon some correction factors, assuming that we didn't find every single bird during surveys, U.S. Fish and Wildlife does believe that we may have actually hit that 3,000 birds in 2018. However, I can tell you that I think 2019 was a pretty rough year across the coast, and the population probably did dip just a little bit last year, unfortunately. Now, in order to facilitate recovery for snowy plovers, Fish and Wildlife broke up the habitat in 6 different recovery units, each with their own goals based upon kind of the habitat that was available to them. So here in the San Francisco Bay, in the interior part of the bay, we're in Recovery Unit 3. This includes Napa, Contra Costa, Alameda, Santa Clara, also Marin, Sonoma, Solano. These were omitted originally when this graphic was made, but really the bulk of that habitat is found in the South Bay, as I mentioned, south of San Mateo Bridge. So most importantly of that habitat is Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. That's located in the Hayward Union City area. That's where over 50% of all snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay breed, and certainly where we spend a lot of our time and what I'll be talking about later in the talk. Aside from that, in the South Bay, we have the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. The most important site among the various locations of Don Edwards is in Ravenswood. That's over in Menlo Park at the base of the Dumbarton Bridge. Aside from that, we do also have some breeding in Alviso ponds, which extends from Mountain View through San Jose. Also in Warm Springs pretty consistently in the Fremont area, and then a little bit less occasionally in the adjacent Maury and Cargill production ponds. So, as I mentioned, there is also some snowy plovers that breed in the North Bay. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that for you folks up there. So there's a few different sites where they're known to breed or where they've been observed. That includes the Napa Sonoma Marshes Wildlife Area, including Pond 77A, as well as the Wingo unit. And then it also includes Hamilton Wetlands in Novato. And lastly, we have the Montezuma Wetlands, which are in Solano County, about 17 miles southeast from Fairfield. There isn't really any good markers otherwise, but it's kind of right along the Sacramento River along the Delta. So in terms of just, kind of the way we work, we need to go out and do plover surveys every day at each site. And what we do is we try to count all the plovers, record their location on the map, and try to identify potential nest locations. And this is essentially what we're looking for. This is a female that's incubating a nest. You can tell by the lighter plumage that she's a female. And when I look at her, I can tell that she's sitting on a nest. She's a little bit puffier. You can tell that her tail is sort of pushed up, that she's kind of sitting on some eggs. If I watched her long enough, she would stand up, she would kind of readjust and sit back down on the eggs. Maybe she might kind of toss some sediment into the nest. But then once we do that, basically we would go out and try to find the nest and actually float the eggs. And what we do, the reason why we float the eggs is this helps us to determine the stage of development of the eggs. When eggs first are laid, they're gonna sink right to the bottom of the water. As they develop, they're going to lose some of the water that's in the egg, and they're actually going to eventually float. So we're able to measure the degrees that they're sitting at the bottom of the water, and then eventually how many millimeters they're floating above the water. This tells us when the nest was initiated. That way we can kind of look at nesting patterns throughout the season, and it also helps us to determine the fate. So if we find a nest one week and we come back the next week and it's gone, and we know that it had just been laid, we know that there's no chance that it hatched. Now conversely, if based upon our projections, it should have hatched somewhere around that time, we'll kind of look at some closer things. If there's no longer chicks in the area, we'll actually look at the bottom of the scrape, look for kind of little hatch shell fragments that'll indicate that the chicks had hatched out of the eggs. Now this is also really important when we want to color band chicks. And the reason we color band chicks is it helps us to track their breeding success, determine how many a proportion of how many of the snowy plover chicks actually fledge. And of course, it also helps us to keep track of individuals. So it's really, really important that we know when they're gonna hatch because as I mentioned, they're precocial and there's really nothing that the nest is gonna provide for them once they hatch. So they're gonna move on typically within a day by the next morning once all the chicks have hatched to find themselves some foraging habitats. Now we use a unique 4-color combo for each individual chick. Some places use the same combo for all chicks because we work in the salt ponds, really, really large landscape where it's kind of tough to see individuals. We give them all a unique combination. Now each left leg combo is unit specific. So black over orange is a combo that only we use. So if other people in other parts of the range saw black over orange or some of our other combos, they would know right away that it was one of our birds. And here we actually have a cool example. This was a bird that I banded at Eden Landing last year, black over orange, yellow, blue. I banded this chick last year at Eden Landing. I confirmed it fledged, I think right at 28 days. I saw it and was happy to see it, but I didn't see it after that until it was reported out at Bolinas Laguna, I believe, out in Point Reyes. So I was really excited to actually see what it looked like as an adult. So kind of cool to have that 2 pictures to compare side by side. Now there are times also when we want to band adults, and obviously adults can fly, so it's not quite as easy as walking up to the nest and grabbing the chicks. So in that case, we use what's called noose mats, and these are essentially kind of these strips of wire that have small nylon nooses attached to them. What we'll do is we'll actually place those around the nest. We'll go and hide. The adult will run back to the nest, and if we're lucky, they'll cross. A lot of adults, or not a lot, but some adults just won't cross the noose mats, and in which case we won't be able to catch them. But hopefully they're able to cross the mats and they're able to get caught, and then we can band them and keep track of them. So on the right, actually, we have probably one of my favorite combinations that we've banded. This adult was banded. He was banded actually at SF2, which is one of the ponds over in Ravenswood, next to in Menlo Park. He was breeding there. I haven't seen him on a nest recently, but I think he probably does breed there, and he's known to winter out on Ocean Beach in Crissy Field in San Francisco. But the reason why I like this bird is the colors of his bands. So I don't know if anyone has any guesses, but I'll give it away here. I like to call him the Bay Area baseball bird. He's kind of fun like that. So in any case, I'm glad to see he is still around. I did see him a few months ago, but I haven't seen him on a nest, partially because the Ravenswood ponds are pretty tough to see birds on. So just to give you a sense how many birds we have here in the San Francisco Bay. One important thing I must note, during the winter, we actually have the interior population of snowy plovers in the San Francisco Bay. As I mentioned, it's the Pacific Coast population of snowy plovers that are listed as federally threatened. There is also an interior population that breeds in places like Mono Lake, and actually the largest population is in the Great Salt Lake. Those birds during the winter are actually going to come to the coast. A lot of them are going to come to the California coast. Some might go to the Gulf Coast. So we're actually going to have higher numbers during the winter time. You can see though, we have still seen this kind of upward trend, which is what we like to see overall. And here's a little graphic just to show you, as far as snowy plovers in the North Bay and Delta, it's kind of up and down, really depends on the year, kind of location. I think in some cases there were some restoration projects going on and a little bit more habitat was available. Certainly I think that was the case in 2008. But there are snowy plovers that definitely winter up in the North Bay and Delta, if you know the right places to look for them. These places that I mentioned, Napa, Sonoma, the Montezuma wetlands, Hamilton wetlands, and a host of other locations. Now, as I mentioned, during the breeding season, we have a smaller population because all of those interior birds, those birds that are migrating, have moved back to their actual breeding grounds. So during the middle of May, everybody conducts a breeding window survey that'll give us kind of an accurate count of our breeding population. So again, looking at this, what you can see is that when we first began monitoring snowy plovers in 2003, we only counted 72. So it was really kind of a somewhat small population. We kind of had these ups and downs. We reached a peak of 275 in 2010. We did observe, unfortunately, kind of a drop after that, but we've kind of steadily climbed back up, and kind of, at least in 2019, we're on a little bit of a decline again. Now, unfortunately, you know, we've only at best come about halfway to meeting our recovery goal, which is 500 adults for the San Francisco Bay. So this is obviously something that's concerning, and we're doing our best really to try and improve habitat for them. I see all these chats. Oh, I'll have to answer these later.
I am monitoring the chat, Ben, so don't worry about it.
Okay, cool. I just kept seeing them popping up.
You're good.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah.
All right. So, and then just to give you a little spiel on breeding plovers in the North Bay and the Delta. As you can see, again, it really depends on the year and on the area. Again, in some situations, there was a lot of breeding plovers there because of restoration projects. But there's something really important to note here, and that's that there really isn't a consistent survey effort in the North Bay and Delta for snowy plovers. They are there. I think in some situations they're just, you know, kind of in places that people aren't looking for them. And so I think there is some activity that goes undetected each year. All right, and I have this real quick video of some snowy plover banding. It's going to be a little bit hard to see the adult running around, but you should be able to hear them. And what you will also potentially see is they're doing what's called a broken wing display. This is essentially where the adult is pretending like they're injured, they're making a bunch of noise, but really trying to get you, kind of lure you away from their nest, from their chicks, so that you'll try and eat them instead of their chicks. So here it is. Always another cute little chick. Oh, one more time. All right, so it's time for our first pop quiz. So, approximately how many breeding snowy plovers were found in the Bay Area prior to European settlement?
So just to remind everybody, go ahead and type it into the chat, whatever you are remembering from what Ben has told us so far. And Facebook, feel free to do the same. And we'll maybe give a few more seconds for people to answer, just because of the delay with between Zoom and Facebook. Ooh, Shannon's getting the head start. She's answering more than one question at a time. That's nice. I like that. The go-getter. So Ben, are you able to see these, or would you like me to read them to you?
Yeah, I see them.
Okay.
Okay. So should I give it away?
Go for it.
All right. So it's. Oh, can I do it? All right. So it's unknown, but it was probably a small population due to limited habitat. What happened basically is, you know, there was a small amount of natural salt pan, probably in Fremont, San Leandro, Hayward, Union City area. There probably were some snowy plovers there, but for the most part, there wasn't a ton of habitat. But what you had is that kind of large scale conversion. At the same time, you had people moving into the California coast, And so plovers got pushed out and they found a home in the salt ponds. Next question, why have snowy plovers declined throughout their range? Oop. Almost gave it away. Well, I'm not seeing, for some reason it doesn't always pop up. I can just go ahead and go with it. So in any case, there's a lot of different reasons. Predators, invasive vegetation, human disturbance, of course, competition sometimes with other species like gulls. And then our last question is, how do snowy plovers try to avoid predators? If they're nearby, what do plovers do? Right. So they are cryptic at all life stages. That really is their best form of defense. They're going to try and hide, blend in. They really don't like flying. And if a predator approaches, they're going to flush off their nest from really, really far. You won't even know unless you have a scope that they're there. If they do come close, they're going to use a broken wing display, and they're going to try and vocalize to distract you. So moving on now. Let's talk about a little bit about how the habitat changed in the South Bay and really throughout a lot of the Bay Area. So historically, the South Bay was a kind of massive tidal marsh. Just really a ton of different kind of snaking sloughs and rivers and channels connecting. What we see here, you'll see, is kind of this wholesale kind of big change from what was a big network of tidal marsh into these salt ponds that were formed kind of in the mid-1800s, as I mentioned. Now, gradually what happened over time is that various companies kind of acquired all of the land. Eventually, it all fell into the ownership of Cargill. And at a certain point, they kind of realized they really didn't need as much habitat or as much land as they had in order to produce salt. And so in 2003, they actually sold the vast majority of their land holdings, both in the South Bay and in the North Bay. And with that, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project was formed. And also, again, in the North Bay, similar project, run separately, but very similar kind of focus also began. Now, just a little bit of background about the South Bay Salt Pond Project. The aim of this project is to restore 15,000 acres of salt pond habitat back to tidal marsh. And the way that they achieve that is by opening up ponds to tidal action. This is kind of a very slow process. They have to be very careful. They have to do a lot of engineering work, a lot of monitoring of various species. So this project is expected to take at least 50 years. It began in 2003. We're about 17 years in. And I should also mention, this is actually the largest tidal marsh restoration project on the West Coast. So it's a really, really big project. Sometimes it flies under the radar, but it is a really cool project and a lot of cool stuff going on. So tidal marsh restoration is going to have impacts on a lot of different species. Some of them are going to be really great. It's going to increase tidal marsh habitat for two different tidal marsh, well, a number of different tidal marsh dependent species, including the California Ridgeways rail, which is only found here in the San Francisco Bay, as well as the salt marsh harvest mouse, which there's the southern population that's found in the South Bay, Alameda, Contra Costa, and then the North Bay population that's found in the Napa, Sonoma marshes. So it'll provide habitat for them. It's also going to improve environmental health because tidal marsh is good at kind of filtering and cleaning out the bay. And it'll also provide resiliency to climate change because tidal marsh is great at soaking up water and kind of act as a barrier during kind of high tides and storm surges and things of that nature. And of course, it is also providing public access via the San Francisco Bay Trail. So it's helping to connect the Bay Trail throughout all of the Bay Area. Now, of course, there are unfortunately some potential negative impacts. And the reason for that is because there's going to be less of the dry pond breeding habitat that snowy plovers, as well as least terns, and also American avocets and stilts have come to rely upon. And something interesting, again, I know I talked about sort of historical stuff. and I talked about the loss of our wetlands here in the Bay Area. There actually is a huge amount of loss of habitat for birds in the Central Valley. So historically, American avocets, black-necked stilts, Forster's terns didn't really breed much in the San Francisco Bay. There again wasn't really much of the type of habitat they like. Most of them bred, or a lot more of them were in the Central Valley. But because that habitat is also gone there, we essentially have those birds coming into the San Francisco Bay as well. So these salt ponds have provided a lot of great habitat for them. And then aside from that, on the same token, we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of migratory shorebirds and waterfowl that either stop over in the San Francisco Bay or they winter here. So the San Francisco Bay is one of the most, if not the most important stopover site during the winter for all of these birds. So unfortunately, less salt ponds means that some of these species could suffer. So obviously the project recognizes that and has tried to figure out ways to accomplish all of these goals at the same time. So a good example of this is Pond SF2. This is over at the base of the Dumbarton Bridge in Menlo Park. Now this is what the pond used to look like, as you can see the historical slough trace. It's kind of this dry salt pond. Fast forward after the pond was reconfigured, and what you can see is that they put some nesting islands in the front. These nesting islands now support American avocets, black-necked stilts, Forster's terns, Caspian terns, and beginning last year, elegant terns, as well as I think maybe some geese and actually a couple pairs of black oyster catchers, which is cool. And then the back of the habitat is actually is managed specifically for snowy plovers. So it's kept as dry, sparsely vegetated habitat to provide some breeding habitat for snowy plovers. Another way that the project has tried to remedy the situation is through oyster shell enhancement, and specifically at Pond D14. After doing some pilot shell plots beginning in 2009, we recommended that we do this large scale oyster shell enhancement at this Pond E14 in Eden Landing, and with that we spread about 23 hectares of oyster shells. I'm forgetting the conversion to acres, but that's a lot of shells. It's a really big area. The goal was to create some high quality and dense breeding habitat, and we hoped that these oyster shells would provide camouflage and cover for snowy plovers throughout all their life stages. So what you can see here, this is a female who is actually sitting on a nest. She's incubating. The nice thing about these oyster shells, these are actually really big oyster shells. These were actually retrieved. These were donated by Drake's Bay before they closed. Unfortunately, we don't have a source of these kind of really large oyster shells anymore. These are not the kind of shells that you would kind of shoot on the half shell, but they really do help snowy plovers blend in. You can imagine when we pull it out, this is a really big area, and finding snowy plovers is tough on us as surveyors, and we hope that it would be the same for predators. And you can see, based upon these nest maps, we've had a lot of snowy plovers that were attracted to these areas. So I got one more video for you guys real quick, and you can kind of see the adults a little bit closer this time. If you listen at the end, you'll also be able to hear some least terns vocalizing right there. So real quick, we're going to play a quick game. I'll give you guys a few seconds. There are 2 snowy plover chicks in this picture. See if you can spot them. And for reference, this is a camera trap picture. So there's one. And here's the other. So they blend in really well. Here we have, looks like the female, she's actually taken the eggshells and going and hiding them, which snowy plovers and other ground nesting species will commonly do to kind of evade, they don't want to really attract any predators to their nest. So there's only one chick here, and it's right there. Again, pretty tough to see. This looks like it's a freshly hatched chick, still kind of wet. And of course, this one's probably a little bit more obvious. We got this chick right here in front. And then underneath Dad, we've probably got a couple more chicks. He looks pretty fluffy. He probably has a chick. We do have kind of some sequential hatching of nests. So sometimes there'll be one chick kind of hanging out. the next chick won't hatch until the next day, and the third one will take a little bit longer. All right, so now we're going to get into some data here. So let's take a look at how this oyster shell enhancement has affected snowy plovers. So in 2015, we actually had a ton of nests in E14. You can see compared to 2014, which was before the oyster shells, we nearly doubled the amount of snowy plover nests in the pond. And we also almost doubled the hatch rate of snowy plovers in this pond. So it was really, really successful. The only kind of slight concern we had was that we did see a higher abandonment rate. So our abandonment rate went up to 7%. Now this is kind of possibly due to kind of more aggression between snowy plovers. Males are very protective of their broods. They will fight with other adults and sometimes even attack other chicks. And unfortunately, we have observed and found chicks who had been killed by other adults. Now, after this year, we were really excited about the oyster shell enhancement, and we were looking forward to 2016. Oh, excuse me, sorry. There was one thing I had to show you guys here. So it was mostly positive, except for we did have some peregrine falcons towards the end of the year that started causing some problems. If you look back in the blind in the corner, you actually see the second adult. And this is an interesting situation because this is a nest that we thought had hatched. We had looked at the nest scrape, found eggshell fragments, and determined that the nest had hatched. However, obviously this camera trap pictures tell a different story. And so that year we actually had peregrine falcons nesting in a hunting blind just a pond over. They definitely were terrorizing plovers at the end of the year, but overall it was a pretty good year for snowy plovers. So again, moving to 2016, we were excited, thinking things were going well. We still had a lot of nests, still close to 100 nests, but our hatch rate was absolutely abysmal. It's down below 25%. We're looking for more, at least 50% of our nests to hatch. So it was a really, really bad year. Big reason this time around, it was ravens. Ravens were really, just constantly on the pond. As I mentioned, we had 88 nests on the pond that year. 60 were depredated. Of those, camera traps recorded 30 of these depredation events. All of those were common ravens. So they really just, they figured it out. They knew that there were snowy plovers here, and they just kept coming for the eggs. We did test to see if they were kind of identifying the cameras, and determined that they weren't really targeting those. So we don't think that it was specifically that, rather that common ravens will actually fly over the pond. They'll actually look for adults flushing off the nest, and then they'll come land and walk around and eventually find where that adult had flushed off the nest. So they're really smart. They have a pretty smart strategy to find those nests. In 2017, though, Least Tern showed up. So it's finally time to talk about Least Terns. So this is actually a little courtship display, which I was happy to see show up on some of our camera traps. And just to give you a little bit of background, so California Least Terns, they range from actually the San Francisco Bay. We are the far northern limit for them, down through Baja, California. Again, some differences between habitat. On the coast, they're mostly going to nest on sandy beaches, sometimes lagoons. Whereas here in the San Francisco Bay, they're going to nest on salt pan, nesting islands, and in some cases on abandoned runways. So a little bit different habitat, but we've adapted and tried to provide them with some nice places to nest. Now, there are 6 different places that snowy plovers have nested in recent years. By far, the most successful is Alameda. Hayward is also a pretty consistent and successful colony. But aside from that, they're really, these other colonies have had their ups and downs, and some of the recovery criteria for least terns, which are actually an endangered species. So some of the criteria for them is to have 3 secure breeding sites within the San Francisco Bay. So because all of these other sites have had some issues, we're kind of unsure whether or not, they can be that third, secure colony. So we were hopeful maybe, Eden Landing, we have these oyster shells, we have a lot of attention paid. Maybe this can be that third secure colony. So back to that oyster shell enhancement. We have snowy plovers, we have least terns. They're best friends forever, right? They're hanging out, they're nesting together. Okay, maybe not quite. But I do like that picture. And for the most part, snowy plovers and least terns do get along, a little bit of occasional fighting, but for the most part, these species you know, commonly nest together in places where they occur together, and you know, for the most part, get along as much as any birds do. So in any case, 2017, that was the first year that snowy plovers were breeding. Well, since 2009, I think there was one nest that year. But in any case, the first year we had a real colony, and they were really successful that year. So we monitored 21 nests. We determined that at least 13 of them had hatched. And from those, at least 20 to 28 fledglings had been produced. So this was really great because our fledges per pair ratio was really, really good. I think the recovery criteria is one fledge per pair. So we either got close to that or more than doubled it that year. And also really interestingly, snowy plovers were pretty heavily affected by Least Terns presence. So you can see 2017, before Least Terns arrived, was kind of a continuation of 2016. We had, you know, close to 40 nests that hatched, only a hatch rate of 25%. I think we were still getting hit by common ravens. However, after Least Terns arrived, you can see we monitored an additional 47 nests. Those remaining nests had a hatch rate of 70%. So our hatch rate went way up. If you look at the map, you can see all those dark blue nest locations surrounding the turquoise. It really, you know, did appear that snowy plovers were selecting for nest sites closer to the Least Terns. So they recognized that there was potentially some you know, something to gain. And I should of course mention that you know, Least Terns form a dense colony, and they aggressively will defend against predators. So, you know, they're a bit more obvious because they're flying back and forth. They eat fish, but you know, the nice thing is that they will defend against predators, and snowy plovers often will take advantage of that. Now, again, looking at the distance from the tern colony, you see these numbers. 94% of the snowy plover nests that were within 100 meters of the colony were successful. You can see that, you know, even greater than 500 meters away, we had over 60% of those hatch. I think a large reason for that is because the terns were pretty successful at chasing off ravens. So it sort of forced them out of the pond in general. And so we had improved nest success for snowy plovers that year as well. So in 2018, Least Terns returned to Eden Landing. We monitored a whole lot more nests, as you can see on this picture. They spread all throughout the pond. We monitored 141 nests. However, it was a pretty bad year for Least Terns, unfortunately. Only 9 of them were determined to hatch, and from those 9 nests that hatched, only 2 to 6 fledglings were produced. So a pretty rough year for Least Terns. If you look really closely at that picture, there are actually 2 Least Tern chicks in there. They blend in pretty well with the gravel. That's that one nest that was on the levee, which we closed that levee, of course. That is a public levee right there. So in any case, so let's take a look at how this affected snowy plovers both before and after. So before, actually, snowy plovers were doing okay. You know, we had monitored about 40 nests, hatch rate of about 41%, which is, you know, we'd like to see it a little bit higher, but it's not terrible. However, after Least Terns arrived, we actually saw their hatch rate go down. Now, again, we did see a lot of snowy plovers that appeared to select nest locations that were near the colony because they were, you know, maybe trying to take advantage of that colony defense. However, that also resulted in them getting, you know, predated upon because of the Least Terns being there and attracting a lot of attention. So in 2018, it was red foxes that were really the culprit here. So these are snowy plover nests that our camera track recorded, but we know based upon the timing that these nests were taken and when the colony, when nests were lost, that red fox were the ones who did it. And just in case we weren't sure to add insult to injury, we did find that a red fox had defecated in one of the nests. So they were able to wipe out a lot of the nests in just a week. We had over 40 nests that were taken. So it's pretty tough to see, unfortunately. So again, snowy plovers, plovers, terns did return to Eden Landing in 2019. This time they used some different habitat. So I had mentioned before that the South Bay Salt Pond Project had created nesting islands in some other areas. Here at Eden Landing, they also did create nesting islands in 2 ponds over from E14. So terns decided to use that. We had at least 40 nests that we had monitored, but unfortunately, only about 4 of those had actually hatched. So it's, again, kind of a tough year for least terns in those E12 nesting islands. We had some snowy plovers who were attracted to nest with them. The early nests did hatch. Those ones were kind of the early part of the colony, and the colony was doing pretty well for a while. It was established early June, but what happened is I think I was there on a Friday, and the whole colony was there. I came back on Monday, and essentially the entire colony had been wiped out. And I think what we determined was that this time it was California gulls who had depredated all of the nests. We looked at our predator data. We noticed that some flocks of California gulls had showed back up in the area. And really all it takes is for a flock of gulls, unfortunately, to land on one of these islands to just kind of devastate the colony, to eat all the eggs, to eat all the chicks. And this is what we think happens. Pardon me one moment. There's COVID-19 problems when you're in your son's room and his nighttime music comes on. All right, so we did also have least terns back at E14. And again, we had a lot of nests. We monitored, I think, a little over 100 nests at least. It became a little bit tough to keep track of. But a lot more of them hatched. That's the good news. We had at least 33% of these nests hatched. But unfortunately, again, we really didn't produce many fledglings. We had 5 to 8 fledglings that we estimate were produced from this colony, which is again pretty abysmal considering we had 48 pairs that were nesting at this pond. So again, let's take a quick look. How did this affect snowy plovers? Before terns arrived, they were doing really, really bad. It was kind of a replay of what we had seen in prior years. Just really poor hatching success. I think relatively poor chick survival, which is a bit tougher to measure, but that's my recollection. So interestingly, after the terns arrived, snowy plover hatch success went way up. Now, as I mentioned, least terns, their colony did survive for longer. We had more of those nests hatched. And so snowy plovers were able to have some better hatching success and decent brood success. It's one thing for nests to hatch. We hope that the chicks that hatch out will actually survive. And I think that was the case to some degree. Interestingly, one thing I have noticed is that, even when a bunch of least tern nests get taken out, some snowy plover nests might get taken out by predators, but the snowy plover nests, I think, blend in better in some ways because sometimes those snowy plover nests that are right nearby aren't found by predators. Just sort of an interesting observation that I had. So 2019, we had a myriad of predators. The most interesting one I'm going to start off with first. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, you see this sort of what looks like snake tracks, right? You've got the sort of winding sort of tracks directly leading to depredated least tern nests, or maybe there were chicks by that point. But this really had us stumped because I think we're gone over a weekend and maybe 10 or 15 nests disappeared, and then I think over 4th of July weekend we come back and another 40 nests are gone, and we've got all these tracks leading to a ton of these nests, and we're thinking, how did one snake eat all of these least tern nests? It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to us. After talking with some of the wildlife services folks who work out there and try to manage the predator population, they suggested that it in fact might be a skunk whose tail was really muddy, that it had walked through marsh, its tail got wet, eventually kind of picked up so much mud that it couldn't lift it. So what I did is actually set out a camera trap in kind of a pond access point where I saw these tracks. Sure enough, you look at the top right picture, we've got this skunk who's got a just really, really muddy tail, so heavy that it can't lift it, and it's just dragging it all over the place. So this was actually, this had a lot of people stumped. We checked in with different wildlife trackers, different snake specialists. People were throwing out all these different ideas for how we were going to trap snakes and figure out who it was, and all these different ideas. And when we finally figured it out and showed them, everyone was kind of chuckling and thought it was pretty interesting. But certainly it showcases again that really every year any predator could be the one that causes the problems. Now, aside from that, harriers were certainly a problem last year. Harriers are a species that breeds in tidal marsh, and E14 is right next to a lot of breached ponds, areas where tidal marsh is restoring. So we have a lot of harriers around us, and they were pretty consistently hunting in the pond. I saw them taking least tern chicks, unfortunately, on a couple occasions. Because the colony is so spread out, they were not quite as effective in defending against harriers. I'd see terns mobbing them, but they would still be able to take chicks. And then also we do have white-tailed kites that breed on the reserve, and I see several juveniles each year. This is a juvenile. You can tell because the rusty coloration on its breast. But all of these predators certainly had a big effect on both snowy plovers and least terns in 2019. So now it's time for our second pop quiz. So who could be negatively impacted by tidal marsh restoration, and how has this been addressed? All right, so pond-dependent breeders and migratory birds are the species who could suffer potentially with tidal marsh restoration. But at least one of the ways that this has been addressed is by reconfiguring the ponds to try and provide habitat for multiple species within the same footprint. So we're trying to kind of make different habitats in the same area. That way we can still keep all these different guilds where they are. Second question: what methods have been used to improve plover and tern habitat, and how successful have they been so far? All right, so we have nesting islands that have been constructed in some areas, ponds that are managed specifically for snowy plovers and least terns, and also the oyster shell enhancement that we just talked about. What we have seen is that this oyster shell enhancement especially was very good at attracting plovers and eventually attracted terns. Unfortunately, what we've seen so far is that predators have recognized that, and it has also attracted predators. So that's really the next step is trying to find ways that we can kind of keep predators away from these birds. And then lastly, how has snowy plover breeding been affected by co-nesting with least terns at Eden Landing? All right, so snowy plovers, and I didn't show some of the statistics, but running some statistical analysis, I did determine that snowy plovers were attracted to breed in close proximity to terns. Some years we saw that they benefited from the protection provided by the colony, but in some years it appeared that snowy plovers faced increased predation risk and lower breeding success because of the increased attention that the least tern colony brought. So sort of an up and down, really depending on the year. So real quickly, I want to tell you guys about some volunteer opportunities for you folks who are in the North Bay Delta area. As I mentioned, this is an area that is really undersurveyed for plovers, and we need your help. We here at SFBBO really do most of the snowy plover monitoring throughout the San Francisco Bay, and so I'm pretty invested in trying to keep track of snowy plovers throughout the Bay Area. And so I'm looking for people who are potentially interested in conducting everything from a weekly survey, if you're just really all about it, to maybe just a monthly survey looking for plovers. This could be at places like Hamilton Wetlands, Napa, Sonoma, or Montezuma, where we know there are plovers. It could also be scouting new sites. I look on eBird, I see reports all the time, especially for wintering birds. They're more likely to be at certain places during the winter than they are during the breeding season. But these are places that are worth checking, and I think aren't always necessarily aren't always looked for in terms of for breeding birds. We can also check just for suitable habitat. If I look on a map, I could probably show you a place that might be good habitat for them. So if you're interested, please feel free to email me. I can give you more information about that. And then also this year is actually the first year of our Least Tern social attraction project. And basically what we did here is in the first weekend of March, which luckily we were able to squeeze it in before everything really kind of hit with the pandemic, but we had a big volunteer event, and we were able to improve the habitat by removing predator perches and kind of getting rid of some vegetation that was a little bit too thick. We spread decoys. We've installed a sound system, and we also put out a bunch of numbered chick shelters and also ceramic chick shelters that have been shown to help chicks, especially evade predators like harriers. So we were hopeful that putting out these chick shelters, if we could get nests to hatch, that they would do okay. So this is again at pond E14. So the reason basically is we want to direct the colony to kind of an enhanced location where volunteers can monitor the colony. What you may have seen from that map is that the colony was really, really spread out all over the pond. It makes it tough for us to monitor them. And then, you know, only a portion of this pond has public trails. The west side and a portion of the northwest corner of it has public trails. So we thought maybe if we could attract least terns to this west side of the pond where they had already nested, that maybe we could get a volunteer program to monitor them, which has been successful at other locations, both in the Bay Area and in Southern California, to keep track of predators. So we thought we could do that and also kind of help ourselves in that sense. So if this is something, you know, if you're interested in helping out with our least terns, you can either sign up for our Colony Watch program, or eventually when things are allowed, we are going to do more habitat events. There are still a lot of predator perches. You'd be surprised how much remnant salt production kind of posts and wood are in those ponds. You know, I think a lot of these ponds in particular were built in the 1850s. A lot of the posts are made of old growth redwood, and that stuff is strong. Even after being submerged and salty, it's still there and doing good. And we see peregrines and you know, lots of different raptors constantly perching on them. So that's certainly one other way we can definitely help the colony. If you're interested, certainly reach out and we can talk more about that. Of course, I have to acknowledge everyone that helped make all of this research possible. Certainly everyone who's been part of the SFVBO field team over the past 5 years. Rachel Turtis and Cheryl Strong from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who helped me with some of the least tern monitoring, as well as John Kraus, the reserve manager at California at Eden Landing, who I work with very closely to manage habitat for snowy plovers and least terns. And with that, that's my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben. The great part of these virtual programs is that if you do have to leave, you can leave and nobody will really even know. So you won't hurt our feelings if you have other things that you need to do this evening. But for those of you who are still interested, we do have a few questions for Ben. So Ben, if you have a couple extra minutes, I know,
yeah.
You know, we're about 15 minutes over at this point, but not quite, but let's get into some questions real quick. We don't have a lot, but we have a few.
Okay.
So our first question is from Laura, and she says that we are living in Marina in the Monterey Bay area. She would appreciate any suggestions you have about conservation efforts and protecting snowy plover habitat, which is at risk from a planned diesel plant. Any suggestions?
And diesel plant. Yeah, so so we actually, you know, we don't do the monitoring down there for the most part. It's actually Point Blue Conservation Science who does the work down there, and those are, you know, some close colleagues of mine that I'm regularly in contact with. We do actually do some surveys down in Seaside, so not too far away from there, and I think either well, I'll be down there tomorrow actually to survey around there. But I would suggest that you contact Point Blue Conservation Science. And they can help direct you to, you know, kind of some efforts for snowy plover recovery down there, because it's, you know, kind of some very specific, you know, kind of habitat needs down there.
Thanks for that clarification. My bad. I read diesel and not desal.
Oh yeah, desalination plant.
Desalination. Yes, I'm so sorry.
Oh,
thank you, Guy, for
there's also an eco resort. There's also sand mine. There's a lot of stuff going on right there that I know about.
So our next question is from Karina, and she's asking sort of what is the overall survival rate each year, which I think you answered a little bit later in the presentation after she asked this question.
Okay, so I can give you some statistics. I can tell you that the average lifespan of a snowy plover, if they do reach adulthood, is about 5 years. Some can live much longer. I know that there is a snowy plover, abandoned snowy plover up in Humboldt that lived to at least 17 years. I mean, I think there's one also in the Monterey Bay who only has 1 foot, by the way. He's footless RA. He's got red aqua on one leg and no foot on the other, and is a pretty successful breeder. So so some birds can live a long time, but unfortunately for the chicks, it's pretty rough. You know, I think it's pretty tough to estimate fledging success for our chicks, just because of the really big ponds, and we're only banding certain proportion of snowy plover chicks. But you know, we're lucky if you know, if our fledging rate is about 30, 35, 40%. And then even after that, even after they learn to fly, a lot of them don't make it through their first winter. So it's really tough. So I get really excited when I see fledglings, but then, you know, some of them I never see again. And it's just unfortunately one of those things. You know, gotta enjoy the small successes and hope we see them again. But yeah, it's definitely a tough life for plovers.
We have a question from Laura, which was answered by Shannon, but Laura asks, how much do their legs grow after banding?
So they don't. They get longer. They don't really get any wider, and that's why we can band them as chicks. You know, it's very different when you talk about songbirds. You know, you typically wait to band songbirds until they're you know, kind of almost out of their nesting stage and into fledglings, because then they've sort of grown into more or less their body. But snowy plovers, because they're precocial, they need to have, you know, kind of more leg strength, at least I assume, and so there really isn't much of a change aside from their legs elongating.
Our next question was a clarification question from Emma. Did you say that the biggest population right now in your study area is at the Dumbarton Bridge area?
It's not. The biggest population is at Eden Landing, and this is kind of where historically, you know, kind of most of the salt pan likely was, and so it makes sense that that's where a lot of them are. However, the largest, kind of the most important breeding site outside of Eden Landing is Ravenswood. So you're on the right track there, Emma. So yeah, it is an important spot. And we actually just surveyed there today. I was really excited. We had not had access due to COVID-19. We were just out there today and I saw a lot of chicks, found a couple nests. They're doing great out there. So happy to see that. And there is also active restoration in progress. So it's important that we keep track of that.
Excellent. Next question is from Laura. A question going back to the foxes. Did the foxes also predate the tern nests, causing their bad year in, I believe you said 2018? Yes,
exactly. That's what. I apologize if that was unclear. Yes, the red foxes depredated. I think, you know, over 40 least tern nests in the course of a week. You know, and potentially more. So yeah, so we under our permit, we're not allowed to put a camera trap directly on a least tern nest, but we had them on snowy plover nests that were close by, and you know, just based on the timing of nest loss, we can determine that it was in fact red fox, and then of course that picture of the scat in the nest was from a least tern nest.
And the final two questions from Guy. Is it helpful to report bird sightings through the Cornell Bird app, or is there something else that is more helpful for your work?
Yeah, so if we're talking about color banded adults, there is actually an email that we use that will go directly to any snowy plover bander. But of course, listing birds on eBird is great. If you don't see a banded bird, it's still valuable data. Like I said, I kind of troll through eBird and look at sightings to see, you know, especially in the Bay Area, there's a ton of different random sites where they could be. I try and keep track of where maybe they might be breeding that we don't know about yet. And so, yeah, reporting through eBird is great. And then also, I'm forgetting the email right now, but it is on I believe Audubon, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife's website.
Right. Do you, question from me, do you guys look at iNaturalist very much, or is it mostly eBird where you're getting your information?
I have never looked at iNaturalist. Okay. I think eBird is pretty extensively used. I think some birders may use iNaturalist, but they probably use both. Mm-hmm. You know, if they're, you know, kind of really into it. And if they I'm not sure. I think a lot of the kind of really hardcore birders that are likely to see plovers are using eBird, but that is a good suggestion because I honestly hadn't even considered looking at it. So I should give that a look and see if there's any extra data I can find.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think most of the more hardcore birders are definitely eBird users for sure. And then the last question we have is also from Guy. Is the restoration overall successful based upon the number of animals and new species, predators included?
Well, it's tough to say because, like I said, this is at least a 50-year project. You know, the main goal of the South Bay Salt Pond project is to restore tidal marsh. You know, so that has been successful in some situations. Ponds that have been breached early on now, you know, support tidal marsh and support, you know, the target species like ridgeways rails. You know, other species like northern harriers have booming populations in the Bay Area now. You know, what we've seen at least is there hasn't been a decline for snowy plovers. So at the very least, it's doing good in that sense. But obviously, we want to find a way to help improve, you know, kind of help their population grow. And it's sort of the same story for avocets, stilts, and Forster's terns. Those are all species that rely upon salt ponds. And in some cases, unfortunately, their populations are declining. So those are things that we're assessing right now because we're just moving into the second phase of the project and looking at different research that needs to be done to help these different species, you know, kind of have their populations stabilize and grow.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Ben. Those are all of the questions that we have for you. Thanks everyone for sticking around a little bit late. We appreciate the interest that you're showing. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we'll let everybody know when our next program is next month.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, everyone have a great evening, and we hope to see you at our next one.